Vladimir Putin has posed as a peacemaker hours after launching one of the biggest and deadliest strikes of his 3-year war in Ukraine. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with those strikes on Kyiv. A massive bombardment of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and indeed cities and provinces right around the country. It was huge. Some 440 Shahed-style drones alone. Those are the Iranian supplied or Iranian designed and now many manufactured in Russia. Sort of relatively crude one-way attack drones. 440 of them. Now, a number of them were dummies, but nonetheless, these drones are used, we know, to try and overwhelm Ukraine's air defences. There was also, and Ukraine's Air Force has put out a list of what was used, and we're going to go through it because it's interesting. 2 Kinzhal missiles fired from Russian Tambov. The Kinzhal, which means dagger, is the missile that Putin claimed was unstoppable. They are, he says, hypersonic missiles. Now, we know they have been destroyed. I've seen the wreckage of one that was destroyed, hit by a Patriot, US-made Patriot air defense missile. There were 16 Kh-101 air-launched missiles. These are big air-launched cruise missiles. 4 calibers, those are the sea-launched cruise missiles, often fired from submarines, can also be fired from Russian warships in the Black Sea. Another 9 Kh-59 or 69. These are air-to-surface cruise missiles. They're smaller, nonetheless, still really powerful. You know, these missiles, all of these missiles that I'm talking about now, are even more, significantly more destructive than the Shahed drones, although those Shahed drones that we're talking about, they have increased their destructive payload over the course of the war. They started flying with about 50 kilograms. That's almost doubled now, the amount of explosive payload they can carry. And finally, though, the other missile that Ukraine mentioned was a Kh-31P anti-radiation missile, just one of those Ukraine's Air Force listed. Now, anti-radiation sounds perhaps like it's sort of something to do with nuclear weapons. Absolutely, it's not. An anti-radiation missile actually is designed to track and target radars. So this is a missile that was most likely aimed at or designed to try and hit something linked to Ukraine's air defense and early warning system, the radar emitters that detect incoming missiles. Ukrainian officials said these strikes killed a total of 28 people and injured at least 134 others. There were devastating images coming out of Kyiv on the morning of the 17th of June, showing huge plumes of smoke, devastated apartment buildings. The sides of entire apartment buildings had been torn down, and Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, came out accusing Russia of using cluster munitions. Now, cluster munitions are banned by convention, but particularly dangerous in built-up areas. Both sides. Ukraine has used cluster munitions. Russia is using cluster munitions. They are not signatories to the conventions banning them, but clearly Klitschko talking about using these sorts of weapons in densely populated civilian areas like cities, like Kyiv, certainly would be close to, if not tantamount to, a war crime. Interestingly, in London this week, I've been at the Land Warfare Conference, where much of the discussion was obviously about the lessons that are being learned from Ukraine, and a lot of focus on Ukraine's early warning system, its missile detection systems, and the huge lengths and the ingenuity of the different things that Ukraine has been doing. And it's a combination, for example, as we've talked a little bit before on this show, about acoustic sensors. That is a web of thousands upon thousands of effectively mobile phones across the country, which can listen for the sound of missiles. Missiles and drones make 2 distinct sounds. There's the aerodynamic sound, the sound of the air passing over the aircraft or the missile, and indeed the sound of the propellant, the engine, the rocket, or the motor. And that is combined with these more sophisticated systems like the radars, and all of that information is pooled very centrally, very quickly, and then dispersed at speed to the different air defense units, because those air defense units range from the small gun crews on World War II style flat guns, which can fire airburst missiles into the sky, and of course at the other end of the spectrum the most sophisticated air defence missiles like the Patriot batteries. Now, Ukraine's Air Force said that it did shoot down a huge number of those drones, some 428 out of 472 missiles it said that it shot down, but of course that leaves 44 that still got through, and even the ones that were shot down, the debris of these enormous missiles and drones still has to land somewhere, and it can still often be devastating. And it was just a few days after this massive strike that we saw Vladimir Putin at the St. Petersburg Forum, which he's been hosting this week, offering to mediate the conflict, not really the conflict between himself and Ukraine, but the conflict between Israel and Iran, which has really dominated the news and indeed the minds of people looking at geopolitics and conflict this week. And so while we're on it, we'll come to what that conflict might mean for Ukraine. But interestingly, Donald Trump's response to Vladimir Putin's offer was, I said, Vladimir, mediate your own conflict. Focus on solving your war. Your help is not needed between Iran and Israel. The conflict, British Defence Intelligence has suggested today that the Iran-Israel conflict could pose both challenges and create opportunities for Russia. It's worth pointing out that Russia is one of Iran's very, very few allies, and that is mutual. Iran is one of Russia's very few allies, but Iran has been supplying Russia with drones and ballistic missiles over the course of this conflict in Ukraine. Now, while Iran is fighting Israel, and that conflict appears to be on the brink of expanding, but while Iran is fighting Israel, it's going to be much harder for them to spare military resources to supply Russia with those munitions. So Russia may find itself starved to some extent of Iranian support, although what we do know is that Iran has already licensed and exported the manufacturing of those Shahed drones to Russia. So most of those drones that we see striking places like Kyiv this week are coming from inside Russia. Just worth noting as well that the scale of that strike this week, 472 missiles and drones in total, is huge. We used to consider, when there were more than 100, that was considered a massive number. Then it sort of jumped to 200. It appears to be growing almost exponentially. And that does make it just, of course, so much harder for Ukraine's air defences to intercept. The other thing we've heard from Vladimir Putin is he said he'd be willing to meet President Zilinski. This has come out of the interviews he's been doing in St. Petersburg with journalists. He's appeared to try and present himself as someone who is willing to make peace, even though that is completely at odds from what we've seen in terms of his actual foreign policy, his actual military policy over the last 3 years. But he said he'd be willing to meet anyone, and that would include, he didn't say it explicitly, but the question framed it, would that include Zilinski? He said he'd be willing to meet anyone, but he's sort of managed to keep a barb in there, an attempt to try and discredit Zilinski. He said he wouldn't be willing to sign anything with Zilinski, and that's an indication of how hollow perhaps President Putin's promises are. But he claimed that he couldn't sign anything with Zilinski because Zilinski is not a legitimate leader. Now, just to unpack that a little bit, Putin's argument is that Zilinski is not legitimate because Ukraine has suspended presidential elections under martial law. Any sensible person looking at the situation in Ukraine would realise it would be both impossible and incredibly dangerous and hugely damaging to Ukraine to hold elections while it is at war. Not least because so many people are involved in the fighting, are on the front lines, they wouldn't be able to vote. Not least because were people to concentrate at polling stations, those would be immensely vulnerable to Russian attacks, and Russia has shown itself so often to be willing to attack civilian targets. Very rich, I would suggest, for a Russian president who's likened himself to the Tsars, who's been in power effectively for 25 years, for a quarter of a century, who rules like a dictator. Rich for him to question the legitimacy of President Zelensky's authority in Ukraine. But nonetheless, that is what we've seen. We haven't talked much about the fighting on the front lines in Ukraine this week. It does continue, particularly fierce Russian attacks around Toretsk and Pokrovsk, both of those in the sort of eastern Donbass direction. Russia continues fighting also in the north, in Kharkiv, in Sumy. It's fighting everywhere. Ukrainian forces paying a significant price to hold the line, but Russian forces paying an even larger price. Before we get on to questions, there's two more things worth mentioning. That is the G7 summit in Canada finished early because Donald Trump cut it short. He ducked out and there was no joint statement at the end, reports suggesting that was because America did not want to sign up to a statement about the war in Ukraine. If we needed any reminders, that it proves to us, proves to the world that America is not on the same page as the rest of its allies about the war in Ukraine. And the one other thing I mentioned is because we touch on extraordinary bits of footage that we see during the week. This week it appears to be footage of a soldier clinging to the back of a moving vehicle as a drone swoops past him. Not clear, as far as we can tell at the moment, whether that drone is friendly or hostile, but nonetheless just a reminder of how pervasive these weapons are in this conflict. If you do have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. And as always, I'll try and answer as many as I can, either on the next week's show, or I'll get into the comments and answer them there. A lot of you picking up on the statement I repeated, the Russian claim last week that Russia wins long wars. This was a position that Russia was making. It was Medinsky, Russia's chief negotiator, making it in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. He claimed that, the longer the conflict drags on, the more it suits Russia. And a lot of you pointed out, well, he appears to have forgotten Afghanistan. It's a really fair point, and it's a point I should have made perhaps at the time, not least because I lived in Afghanistan for many years and studied and reported on that conflict there very closely. Russia, for those who don't know, invaded Afghanistan in 1979, ostensibly to support a communist regime that was under threat. They left in 1989, and that communist regime almost immediately toppled as the country descended into civil war, and that civil war eventually led to the Taliban takeover. Russia paid a huge price for its occupation of Afghanistan in terms of lives and military materiel. It was bled during that conflict by the Afghan Mujahideen, who were supported by America, principally by America, and notably by Stinger surface-to-air missiles, which, for example, helped the Mujahideen shoot down Russian helicopters. In some ways, you could draw parallels perhaps to the conflict that is going on in Ukraine, but the conflict in Ukraine is just on such a bigger scale. But nonetheless, Russia is paying a huge price. That's what we talked about, those million casualties last week. And Ukraine is being supported by America and its other allies. America's support ongoing at the moment, but precarious since Donald Trump has come into power. One of you asking questions about the small diameter glide bombs, the GBU-39s that were given to Ukraine early on in the conflict. Why aren't they making more of a difference? These were one of the many weapons that Ukraine and its allies hoped might have been a game changer, to use a phrase we hear a lot, might have helped them turn the tide. These are modified. They were originally missiles to be fired from aircraft. They've been modified, had rockets fitted to them so they can be fired from the ground. They're relatively cheap. They were supposed to be very accurate because they're GPS and inertial guided. But in fact, what we've seen in this conflict is they haven't proved as effective as Ukraine and its allies would have hoped. And that's largely, it's thought to be down to Russia's huge evolutions in electronic warfare. Both sides have made significant evolutions, but effectively, in simple terms, that's GPS jamming. So the small diameter glide bombs, less useful, less effective. We've seen the same thing, same degradation of the HIMARS or the GMLRS missiles. They've become less accurate over the course of the time they've been used in Ukraine because of that jamming. But the final question for today is a question that we do often get, that is who is winning, but this time it comes out more in the sentiments, I think, in the comments, suggesting that perhaps we're painting Ukraine as victorious when in fact they're not, that Russia's winning, they're suffering. We do try and report this as fairly and straight as we can. We have not shied away from the fact that Ukraine is suffering immensely in this conflict. It is paying a huge price. We reported in last week's show that Zilinski has referred to 390,000 of his countrymen wounded, 45,000 killed. That is significantly lower than the Russian toll, but it is nonetheless a huge toll in and of its own. Russia is, on the whole, gaining ground. Russia is advancing, Ukraine is losing territory. That is the momentum of the conflict at the moment. But the point we make is that while Ukraine pays a heavy price for defending its territory, Russia pays a much higher price in terms of men and material for the ground that it takes. Therefore, as we've said before, it's an attritional conflict. It's a battle of wills and resources to see which side can continue in the fight for the longest. And the point that I've made before, I will make again, is that it's worth remembering that during World War II, the tide of the conflict is not always linear. So the Allies, the British, were losing World War II, and indeed the Americans were losing in World War II up until about 1942. And there were two significant turnarounds. There was the Battle of the Atlantic, where the German Nazi U-boats were effectively defeated, and there was also General Montgomery's defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps. That's when the tide started to turn. But we also saw, for example, the Nazis were winning when they invaded Russia on the Eastern Front until eventually the siege of Stalingrad failed and they were forced to retreat. So things go both ways. Tides can turn, and that is certainly what Ukraine is fighting for and hoping for. As ever, thank you very much for watching. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. Remember, you can join Frontline. A few of you talking about all the bots in the comments. If you join Frontline, that will give you an accredited member's badge. It will help us prioritize your questions, help us see them and answer them. And I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle and we're heading towards the Russian border.